The biggest announcement at WWDC 2022 was probably the new M2 MacBook Air. However, Apple definitely did not tell you everything about this new, thinner laptop, which sports some interesting design decisions, hidden upgrades, and even some hidden downgrades from the older M1 MacBook Air. And we're still 1 month away from being able to actually purchase this laptop. So for this video, I want to focus on some details that Apple didn't tell you about the new M2 MacBook Air. And I'm sure, even if you've watched some other videos telling you that there were some secrets, I'm sure you'll learn some things by watching this one as well, because I got some really interesting ones. Now, the first thing that Apple did not tell you about the new MacBook Air has to do with the size of the laptop. There's a couple of interesting things here. Now, first of all, based on Apple's presentation, you might think the MacBook Air is the smallest laptop that Apple has ever made. However, that is not necessarily true. The 12-inch MacBook still holds the crown as the smallest MacBook ever, weighing in at just 2 pounds, while the M2 Air weighs 2.7 pounds. Interestingly enough, when the 12-inch MacBook was made, Apple touted the butterfly keyboard as being essential for achieving its thin design. So you might think that in order for Apple to make a thinner laptop than the 12-inch MacBook, they would have to bring back that old butterfly keyboard. Well, you would be wrong, because the new M2 MacBook Air is actually the thinnest MacBook that Apple has ever made, measuring in at just 11.3 millimeters in thickness. The 12-inch MacBook was 13.3 millimeters in thickness. So it looks like Apple has actually made a thinner laptop while still using a traditional scissor switch key mechanism for the keyboard. And this is an area where I hope to look a lot more closely when I actually get my hands on the MacBook Air next month. I really just want to see how thin and light this thing feels. Now, while this is the thinnest Mac laptop ever made, it's actually not the thinnest Mac ever made. That title belongs to the M1 iMac, which features a ridiculously thin design at 11 millimeters. And while thinner overall than the thickest point of the old MacBook Air, the new M2 Air is technically thicker than the thinnest point on the M1 Air because it had a sloped design. Speaking of size tidbits, another thing that Apple didn't tell you about the new M2 MacBook Air is it's actually bigger overall than the M1 MacBook Air. Now, both of these laptops share the same exact width, but in terms of depth, the new M2 MacBook Air is just slightly larger at 8.46 inches compared to the M1 Air at 8.36 inches. I imagine this increase in depth probably has to do something with the body of the Air now having the full-size function key row rather than the half-size function key row found on the older M1 Air model. Now, while the new M2 Air has a larger 13.6-inch display, one thing Apple definitely didn't tell you in their presentation is that it actually has a lower pixel density than the M1 Air. Yes, this was actually really surprising for me to find out. As I went over all the information and tech specs, I realized that the MacBook Air has a resolution of 2560 by 1664, which wasn't necessarily the right increase to keep the same pixel density. And if you do the math, or just look at Apple's tech spec page, you can find out that the MacBook Air, the new M2 MacBook Air, has a pixel density of 224 pixels per inch. The M1 Air's resolution is 2560 by 1600 on a 13.3-inch display, which gives you a total pixel density of 227. So technically, the older MacBook Air has a sharper display than the new Air. Although I really doubt that anyone will be able to tell the difference in such a minuscule change in pixel density. But it is an interesting tidbit about the new M2 MacBook Air. Technically, you could say if you own the old one, that you have the sharper display. Now, one area where Apple might be underplaying the new MacBook Air is with battery life, because Apple is advertising the M2 MacBook Air with the same 18 hours of battery life as the M1 model. Now, the M1 model has great battery life, but if you look at the tech specs, the M2 Air features not only a more energy-efficient M2 chip, but it actually features a larger 52.6 watt-hour battery than the old M1 MacBook Air, which has a 49.9 watt-hour battery. That is a 5.4% increase in battery size. Coupled together with the more energy-efficient M2 chip, it's likely that the M2 MacBook Air will see slight battery life improvements over the M1 model. I'm actually surprised Apple didn't mention this. I feel like we're gonna see longer battery life on this new Air. And I almost wonder if they neglected to tell us about the increase in battery size, maybe because they didn't want to downplay the 13-inch M2 MacBook Pro, which is supposed to have 20 hours of battery life. Maybe these laptops are closer in battery life than Apple wants you to know. Another thing that Apple really neglected to tell you at their event is that the new M2 MacBook Air is actually the same price as the new M2 MacBook Pro. Yes, this is something very few people are realizing right now, but the entry-level M2 MacBook Air is featuring a lower binned M2 chip with only 8 GPU cores enabled instead of the full 10 cores. If you upgrade the M2 MacBook Air to the full 10-core GPU specification, the same starting configuration found on the M2 MacBook Pro, you'll realize that the M2 MacBook Air is literally the same $1,299 price point as the Pro model, making this one of the most confusing Mac lineups for most customers on which Mac they should get. In fact, from that point on, any upgrade you make to each of these Macs will then carry the same price point increase. And upgrading both of these machines all the way, both of them max out at the same $2,499 starting price. So Apple is selling you 2 different laptops under 2 different names, but they're the same exact price. What is going on here? Now, this one isn't about the MacBook Air, but you're going to be deciding on buying a new M2 laptop pretty soon probably, and I think it's important to tell you that Apple really glossed over the fact that the M2 MacBook Pro does not feature the same internal upgrades as the MacBook Air when it comes to things like the webcam and the speakers. So the old MacBook Pro still just has a 720p webcam, and it still has the old speaker system. The new MacBook Air has an improved 1080p camera, and it also has a new 4-speaker system. So even though the MacBook Air is pitched as the cheaper laptop, it actually has multiple hardware upgrades over the M2 MacBook Pro. Apple also really failed to go over the fact that the entry-level Air still ships with just a 30-watt power brick, and that if you want the new dual USB-C power brick that they showed at their event, that you'll have to spend $20 more on the base model configuration, and there's even an optional 67-watt charging brick that is also offered at the same $20 upgrade price, although by upgrading the MacBook Air to certain specifications, eventually that charger will be included, and then you'll be able to pick between the dual USB-C charger or the 67-watt power brick, which can fast charge the MacBook Air to 50% in 30 minutes of charging. Now, while I've showered a lot of praise on the M2 chip and the new MacBook Air, one major weakness was still not addressed, and Apple failed to mention that the new MacBook Air is still only capable of natively driving just one external display at a time. Another thing that Apple failed to tell you is that for some tasks, the M2 MacBook Air is going to be faster than the M1 Pro MacBook Pro, and even possibly faster at certain tasks than even the M1 Ultra Mac Studio. That's because the M2 chip should feature faster single-core performance, and most of the apps that you use every day, like launching apps, web browsing, word processing, social media apps, listening to music, and so on, are likely to operate faster on the new M2 MacBook Air. This laptop will still be weaker in multi-core performance and in GPU performance, but for single-core tasks, the things that we do most on our laptops, well, those everyday tasks could be actually faster on this MacBook Air, and it should feel even snappier than even some of those higher-end models. Finally, let's talk about the new midnight color. So since the event, people have actually had some hands-on time with this new M2 MacBook Air. And one of the details out of these hands-on videos is that the new midnight color for the M2 MacBook Air looks different than in the online marketing. The online marketing really makes this look like just a dark navy blue color. However, hands-on videos say that this midnight color can vary depending on the amount of lighting in the room. In a well-lit room, it does look navy blue, but in dimmer settings or the way the light hits the laptop, the midnight color can switch to kind of looking like a just deep, deep black color. Furthermore, based on Marco Arment's observation, the midnight color, he says, is a fingerprint magnet compared to the lighter colors like silver. So that might be something to keep in mind before you order this color, because you shouldn't order it. I'm gonna order that color. That color, that's mine. So I need less people to order the midnight color so I can make sure that I get it on day one. You know, I gotta review it, so I think I take a little bit more priority over you. Okay, feel free to order it. All right, everyone, and that is basically all the information I found out about the new M2 MacBook Air that Apple really failed to go over in their presentation. Hopefully, you found the video informative, and if you did and you found something new that you didn't know before, all I ask is that you leave me a like, and if you're interested in future coverage on the M2 MacBook Air, consider subscribing to the channel because this is going to be a very interesting Mac to review, and I'm sure we will find out even more interesting tidbits once this thing is actually in our hands. All right, everyone, thank you for watching, and maybe I'll see you in the next one. Peace. Victory.